Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's my first look for week 16 of the NFL season over on Draftkings. And if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button. It really helps me out and I really do appreciate it. And while you're at it, you might as well hit that notification bell as well so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And YouTube tells me that around 50% of the people watching these videos have not yet subscribed. So if you're a frequent visitor to the channel or if you're just new and you like what you see, consider that subscribe button because it really helps the channel grow. And that obviously helps me out as well. And if you don't follow the social medias, and they're bottom left hand corner of your screen. And if you help support the channel over on Patreon, that's always much appreciated. You get access into the entire NFL DFS data sheet. I also do NBA sheets as well with projections and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in that, I know NBA starts up today. Link is down below there as well. But I think that's it for the plugs. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. And up top, we have a very expensive Patrick Mahomes at $8,500. This is the most expensive he's been all season long, but this is a great spot versus the Atlanta Falcons. This game also features a 53.5 point over-under, which is the highest on the slate, and the Chiefs have a 32.25 implied team total, which is also the highest on the slate. So I guess the only concern here is that they are 11-point favorites, and they pretty much got their first seed locked up. So if they get to a substantial lead, maybe they take out Patrick Mahomes and take it easy. But if this game stays close, Patrick Mahomes could have an absolute monster game. If this game did end up getting out of hand, I assume it's on the back of Patrick Mahomes probably throwing for over 300 yards, and I'd say like 3 to 5 passing touchdowns, something similar we saw to the New York Jets. But the Atlanta Falcons are a much more competitive team than the New York Jets, so I'm not putting them in that same category, but it is a pretty large spread at double-digit points at home. And as always, we'll start with the quarterback position. And up top, we have a very expensive Patrick Mahomes at $8,500. This is the most expensive he's been all season long, but he's in a great spot here versus Atlanta's pass funnel defense. They've been pretty tough versus running backs this season, but they've really struggled versus quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends. And what better trio to have at those positions than Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill? We also know Clyde Edwards-Helaire is doubtful for this game, so if he's out, it's just going to make the Chiefs have to rely on their passing game even more than they already do. And it's just such a good spot versus Atlanta. They have the highest implied team total on the slate at over 32 points. They have a really nice 53.5 point over-under, which is the highest on the slate. The only problem is that they are 11-point favorites, so maybe if this game gets out of hand, they take Patrick Mahomes out because they pretty much have that first seed locked up. We see him come out like in the fourth quarter at some point, but if that happens to be the case, it's probably because Mahomes threw for over 300 yards and like 3 to 5 touchdowns. So I'm not really concerned either way. The only concern I really have is that he is super expensive. So I view him as more of a tournament option compared to a cash game option. Like Jalen Hurts is much more appealing in cash games to me at $7,000. He also offers you that rushing upside as well. But looking at the specific numbers for Atlanta, they're 20th DVOA versus the pass, and they're dead last versus quarterbacks, allowing nearly 26 Draftkings points per game and over 300 passing yards per game as well. So if you got the money for Mahomes, he's an excellent option, but I have a hard time seeing being able to come up with $8,500 really easily on this slate. But if you got the money for it, I think that's absolutely great. But dropping down to more of a cash game option here, he's $1,500 cheaper than Patrick Mahomes. He's coming off a monster game versus Arizona Cardinals. We had over 40 DraftKings points. But it's Jalen Hurts here at $7,000 and a great matchup versus Dallas. And honestly, it feels like we're just getting Lamar Jackson at a decent discount here. He also throws the ball more as well, and he tends to run the ball more. Now, we only have a small sample size from him, but he's ran the ball 18 times versus the New Orleans Saints and 11 times last week versus the Arizona Cardinals. But the difference is he's thrown the ball a ton as well. He had 30 passing attempts versus the Saints and 44 passing attempts versus the Arizona Cardinals. That's not something we'll ever see from Lamar Jackson. So at $7,000, it's a great spot here versus Dallas. Lamar Jackson, a similar quarterback to Jalen Hurts, where he can run the ball and throw the ball decently as well. He had a pretty big game versus them, had close to 100 yards on the ground. I would not be surprised if Hurts gets close to 100 yards rushing in this one and maybe 200 plus passing yards, get a couple of touchdowns. When he had a touchdown on the ground, he can definitely pay off his $7,000 price point. Both these teams also play at a pretty fast pace, so there should be plenty of opportunities to throw the ball and just run the ball for Jalen Hurts here. And on the season, the Cowboys are 23rd DVOA versus the run, and they're 17th versus quarterbacks, so kind of just mid-range. They're just slightly below average, but overall still a good spot here for Jalen Hurts, and I think he can definitely pay off his price point once again, as long as he continues to run like he is. So I view him as a very nice cash game option. You get a nice discount off of him from Lamar Jackson. I feel like they have somewhat similar upside this week. Then dropping down to the mid-range slash, I guess, cheap quarterbacks here, we have Baker Mayfield at $6,100 versus the New York Jets. Now, look, I'm a big Browns fan, but I've never really recommended Baker for DFS purposes outside of showdown slates, but he's been playing great in the second half of this season. He's actually quarterback 3 for the past month, and he's one of the highest graded quarterbacks over on PFF this season. So Baker Mayfield has definitely been playing good football. Looks like it's a great matchup versus the Jets. But looking at his recent game log, he had 21 points last week versus the Giants, 34 versus Baltimore, 35 versus Tennessee, then only 18 points versus Jacksonville. But he's had 2 of those 4 games were over 300 passing yards, and last week versus the Giants, he just missed 300 at 297. He's been throwing a lot of touchdowns as well, not really turning over the ball too much this season, so I like the price point. The only concern here is that this is a run-first football team. They are 9.5-point favorites on the road here versus the Jets. So if they're up, they're just going to just pound Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt for the majority of this game, so that can limit Baker Mayfield's upside. But if he can have a decent first half where he can get you 2 to 3 touchdowns, maybe if we're lucky, and if he can end the game around 250 to close to 300 passing yards, that's going to be good enough to pay off his price point of $6,100. We're just going to have to hope he's efficient with his limited opportunities, because on the season he's throwing the ball less than 30 times per game. I have a hard time seeing the Browns not have success on the ground with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt here. And the Browns need to win this game to make sure they can solidify themselves into the playoffs. They have one of the highest implied team totals on the slate. So I'm viewing this more of a Nick Chubb game and Kareem Hunt game, but I still like that price point on Baker Mayfield versus technically the worst pass defense in football, DVOA-wise. They're dead last 32nd DVOA versus the pass, and they're allowing the third most points per game to the quarterback position and roughly 300 passing yards per game. So I think Baker Mayfield is a fine tournament play, but in cash games, it's just such a run-heavy team. I just have a little bit of concerns about that. And then we can play Jared Goff below $6,000 versus Seattle, which should be more of a pass-heavy approach for them. So I'd say Goff's probably a better play in cash games rather than Baker Mayfield, just because there should be more opportunity for Jared Goff. But getting into Goff here, the Rams actually dropped a game versus the team we were just talking about in the New York Jets. Surprisingly, I could not believe they lost that game. Overall, very bad game from that offense. But Goff checks in a little bit too cheap versus one of the worst pass defenses in football this season, the Seattle Seahawks. Now, if you're looking at the overall numbers this year, they're absolutely awful. But if we're looking at the recent games, they've definitely improved defensively through the air, but they're still 25th DVOA versus the pass, and they're still allowing the fourth most points per game at the quarterback position and over 300 passing yards per game. So I like the price point here. He's got good wide receivers to get the ball to in Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, and those guys both have excellent matchups for this versus the Seahawks secondary that's ranked dead last versus wide receivers this season. He's also throwing the ball close to 40 times per game, and the Rams tend to play at a decently fast pace. So I think this is a good spot, bounce back spot for the Rams here, and especially Jared Goff at only $5,900. And he makes being able to spend up for other positions quite easily at that price point. And then Mitch Trubisky at $5,700. I guess that'd be more of a tournament option here just because people do not like playing Mitch Trubisky. But that Chicago Bears offense has definitely been able to put up some points in recent games, and especially last week as well, where they had 33 points versus the Vikings. But looking at their past 4 games, they had 33 points versus Minnesota. Houston, they had 36. Detroit, 30. Then Green Bay, 25. So they're putting up some points. And Trubisky, going up against Jacksonville, I think there's a decent shot. He can get close to 300 yards passing and 2 to 3 touchdowns in this game. This is one of the worst pass defenses of football. And they have a team total close to 30 this week. So I actually don't mind going down to Mitch Trubisky. They're ranked 31st DVOA versus the pass. And they're also allowing the second most points per game to the quarterback position. So if you need a value quarterback this week, Jared Goff and Mitch Trubisky are both looking like some pretty enticing options. Baker Mayfield is as well, but they're just more of a run-heavy team, so I do have some concerns there. But we definitely have some options to go cheap at quarterback this week. Now, as of right now, my preference would be able to getting up to Jalen Hurts in cash games, but if you have to go with one of these cheaper quarterbacks, I have no issues with that at all. And if you want to do a stack in tournaments, I don't mind Patrick Mahomes with a guy like Travis Kelce and Tyreek Hill, but I think that's it for the quarterbacks right now, so we'll move on to the running back position, which, to be honest, is not that great on this slate. The second most expensive running back is Nick Chubb here at $7,800. We do have Christian McCaffrey on the slate, but I'm not even sure if he's going to play, so I did exclude him from this list. If he happens to be good to go later on in the week, I guess he would be an option, but even then he's facing a pretty tough defense in Washington. But starting up top here with Nick Chubb, just shy of $8,000. The Jets have been pretty tough versus running backs this season. It's definitely easier to move the ball passing on them, but this is a team that loves to run the football. And the Jets are 8th DA versus the run and are kind of mid-pack versus running backs, allowing the 14th fewest points per game to the position. But overall, Nick Chubb is one of the best running backs in football. The Browns have one of the best lines in football, if not the best offensive line, and he's very efficient with his touches. The only problem with rostering Nick Chubb is Kareem Hunt, because they pretty much split the snaps. It's always going to cap his upside. But when he gets opportunities, averaging 5.6 yards per carry, has a rushing touchdown per game this year. Only averaging 16.5 carries per game, which is not that bad. The only problem is he's not really involved in the passing game, just about a target per game this year, and less than a 5% target share, actually less than a 4.5% target share. So Kareem Hunt's definitely got the passing game role for the Cleveland Browns, but if the Browns are going to be leading this game, they're 9.5-point favorites. This sets up well for a big Nick Chubb game, and if he can get over 100 yards on the ground and 1 to 2 touchdowns, he can pay off that price point of $7,800. Just the only concern, it's Nick Chubb, and he doesn't really catch passes, but the game flow does set up well for Nick Chubb. Then David Montgomery at $7,700. I remember about a month ago he was $5,500 versus the Detroit Lions, and people were telling me they did not want to play him. So at $7,700, I'm sure you guys really don't want to play him, but the past month he has been amazing. He's been the running back one. He's putting up big numbers each and every single week. He's getting the volume, and he just happens to keep getting good matchups. And then once again, we get another really good matchup here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I'm not saying he's going to keep repeating 30-point fantasy outings, but the way he's been playing, I would not be surprised here. And the good matchups just keep on coming for David Montgomery here. But just looking at the game log for him in his recent games, he had 32 points last week versus Minnesota, had over 30 carries in that game. And then versus Houston, 27, Detroit, 27, and Green Bay, 28 points. And the thing is, he's really the only running back in that backfield. No Trey Cohen, so he's going to be involved as a pass catcher as well. Looking at the targets he's getting recently, he had 2 last week, but 4, 4, 6. I know those aren't crazy numbers, but at least raises his floor a bit, and he's a capable pass catching running back. Now, he's kind of priced out here at $7,700. I would have liked him last week versus Minnesota. They're not that great of a run defense, but at $7,000, I thought he was a bit priced out, but he just keeps on performing well, and they have no issues at all just giving him the rock. So I don't mind David Montgomery. I could see him having a pretty big game here versus Jacksonville. The volume should be there. He's looking pretty good recently, and they're allowing the 3rd most points per game to the running back position. They're also 24th DVA versus the run, and they're also 7.5 point favorites here. So I think this sets up well once again for David Montgomery to have another strong game. Not saying he's going to get 30 plus points, but would not be surprised if he can get you 20 plus here. And then Austin Eckler at $7,600. I feel like he's more of a tournament play, but his involvement in the passing game always gives him such a nice floor every single week. Now, he only had 4 targets last week, which kind of matched that game versus New England, where he only had 4 targets. But overall, we should expect close to double-digit targets for Austin Eckler most weeks. And this is a good spot versus Denver. Their defense has been depleted. Now, mostly in the secondary, where they lost like 3 corners now, 3 of their starting corners. But they haven't been that great versus the run either this season. They're ranked 25th versus the run, and they're 20th versus running backs, allowing over 100 rushing yards per game. I know Eckler isn't the kind of guy you expect to get like 20, 30 carries on the ground, but he should get around 10 to 15 carries, and he should see close to double-digit targets on the season, around an 18% target share. You got to keep in mind, he did leave the game early and did have a game with Tyrod Taylor, so if you take those games out of the equation, we're probably talking closer to a 20% target share, if not a little bit more. But the only real problem with him is that Kalen Ballage is still a factor in this offense, which obviously does limit his upside a bit, but I still think he's a fine tournament play. Then dropping down to more so in the mid-range, we have Tony Pollard at $6,500. Now, if Zeke happens to be good to go in this game, obviously I'm not going to play Pollard at $6,500, but if he happens to be out, Pollard played on 90% of the snaps last week and was RB1 on the entire week, scored over 30 Draftkings points, had that really nice long touchdown there at the end of the game to kind of ice off his decent day, but he's going to play the majority of the snaps. If Zeke happens to be out again, he's going to get the majority of the touches. He was involved as a pass catcher as well, which was really nice to see, which raised his floor up quite a bit. Because he really didn't have that big of a day on the ground if you take out that long touchdown that he had. But he had 12 carries, 2 touchdowns. But through the air, he had 9 targets, 6 catches, 63 yards, not getting to the end zone. But if he's going to have that kind of usage again, he's definitely in play here, even though the price is up at $6,500. Now, the matchup versus Philly, they're a little tough on running backs. So it's easier to throw in Philly than it is to run. They're 13th versus the run. They're allowing the 11th fewest points in the running back position. But the usage Pollard had, he'd certainly be in play if Zeke happens to be out. Then dropping down to Le'Veon Bell here at $5,800. And he's actually one of the best plays at the position this week, just due to the fact that Clyde Edwards-Helaire is expected to miss this game. So he's going to be the starting running back for the best offense in football, below $6,000. He's also a capable pass-catching running back as well. They have the highest implied team totals, the highest over-under game, and they're 11-point favorites at home. So everything sets up well here for a nice Le'Veon Bell game. I know he hasn't been the most efficient runner in the world the past few seasons, but he's a capable pass-catching running back on the season. He's got close to a 20% target share. And you got to keep in mind Clyde Edwards-Helaire is playing in pretty much all of those games. So I would assume he's going to get a handful of targets here. And I know the matchup as a running back versus the Falcons is pretty tough. They're 4th versus the run, and they're allowing the 7th fewest points per game to the position. But for the past couple of seasons now, or at least past few seasons at the very least, they've struggled versus pass-catching running backs. They are allowing close to 6 catches per game this season to their RB position and close to 40 receiving yards. So Le'Veon Bell, I do like him a ton this week, and I think he's a great RB2 or even flex play. And then after that, we have some cheap running backs that I think are at least viable below $5,000. But we'll start with Giovanni Bernard here in one of the best matchups you can ask for versus the Houston Texans. Looking at their numbers this season, they're allowing the 2nd most points per game at the position, about 140 rushing yards per game and well over a rushing touchdown. They're also 29th DVA versus the run as well. So it's obviously a great spot for Giovanni Bernard. But they are 8.5-point dogs here, but he is the main pass-catching running back in this offense, so I think either way he should be fine. Now, last week, he's coming off a monster game, or actually last night if you're watching this video on Tuesday. He had a monster game versus the Pittsburgh Steelers of all teams to go off against because he struggled mightily recently, especially in that matchup versus Dallas where he only had 4.3 points, but 22.7 points last night, 25 carries, which is by far a season high, 83 yards, got into the end zone, also added a receiving touchdown as one lone target as well. I'm not expecting him to get close to 30 touches once again, but if he can get us like 15 to 20 touches at that price point in this matchup versus Houston, I definitely think he's in play at that price. Then Henderson at $4,500. Cam Akers is going to miss this game, so it's going to be some mixture of Henderson and Malcolm Brown in this game. I wouldn't say either are amazing plays, but at those price points, there's at least some value there, and I think one of them probably gets into the end zone. So whichever one scores is obviously going to be a decent value over on DraftKings at their price. It should be close to an even split. Obviously, one's going to outsnap the other a little bit, but I would lean Henderson getting the most touches in this game. Malcolm Brown's the bare minimum at $4,000. Henderson's a little bit more expensive, but I think the volume will be there a little bit more for Henderson here. So I think he's a viable play versus Seattle. Now, you've obviously wanted the passing game versus Seattle this season, but they're still 23rd versus running backs, despite being 11th DVA versus the run, and they're allowing over 6 catches per game to the running back position. But I do think Henderson is a pretty solid play at the price. Then Ito Smith has been named the starter over Todd Gurley, so at $4,000 on a decent matchup versus Kansas City. Now, game flow-wise, it's probably not the best for a running back, but he should be able to get a handful of targets here. He's had games where he's gotten a decent amount of targets, so assuming he can get like 15 carries on the ground and maybe like a handful of targets, we could be looking at anywhere from, I'd say, 15 to 20-ish opportunities, and that's good enough for me at the bare minimum at $4,000. And the Chiefs do struggle versus running backs. They're 30th DVA versus the run, and they're 21st versus the position. And they're also allowing nearly 5.5 catches and 50 receiving yards per game. So at the bare minimum for running backs at $4,000, and what should be a very high-scoring game, if you can get some dump-offs, I think you can pay off that price point at $4,000. Then moving on to the wide receiver position, up top we have a very expensive Tyreek Hill at $9,000. This is the most expensive he's been all season. And that's the only problem with playing the Chiefs. They're in a great spot, and they're obviously great plays, but you have to pay $9,000 for Hill, $8,500 for Travis Kelce, and $8,500 for Patrick Mahomes. So you're really breaking the bank there, and you really need them to go absolutely off and hit their ceilings to be able to pay off their price points. But I would not be surprised if they do that versus Atlanta. Like I've said earlier, they have the highest implied team total on the slate, and the matchup through the air versus the Falcons is great. I mean, they're allowing the second most points for the position. They're 23 versus the pass, over 200 receiving yards. Assuming this game doesn't get into an absolute blowout and the passing game just really doesn't do too much and it's just a Le'Veon Bell show, I mean, Tyreek Hill should get probably close to 150, 200 receiving yards in this game and more than likely find the end zone. He tends to score each and every single week. And I know most people view Tyreek Hill as a boomer bust option. And when I say bust, I mean like 10 to 15 points. But for the most part this season, he has been very consistent. He has one game below double-digit points. That was all the way back, I want to say, week 5 versus Buffalo. We're only at around 5 points in that game. But besides that, he's in the end zone pretty much every single week. We know he's got big play upside. I mean, just a couple of plays can make him one of the best plays on the entire slate. We saw that versus Tampa Bay where he had 60 DraftKings points. And I'm not saying he's going to get 60 points again, but it's certainly in the cards for a guy like Tyreek Hill in this kind of matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. Then dropping down to some more affordable plays, we have Allen Robinson at $7,700 in a great spot versus Jacksonville. And he's usually one of the highest targeted wide receivers. But last week, I mean, he had below double-digit targets and actually only ended the game with 5 targets. But assuming that comes back up in this matchup versus Jacksonville, I do think he's a pretty strong play to pair with Mitch Trubisky in tournaments. Don't think you have to go there in cash games, but I do think they're a fine tournament play. But Jacksonville this season, they ranked 31st versus the pass, and they ranked 25th versus wide receivers. So if you got the money for a Robinson, Mitch Trubisky stack, which really doesn't break the bank, I do think they're in a pretty good spot. Then Keenan Allen at $7,500. He broke fantasy owners' hearts last week after telling the camera to start him before the game started. You definitely did not want to do that. He caught 1 pass in that game and also played not the full amount of snaps. But on the bright side, that game was on Thursday, so he's got about 10 days of rest here till his next game against the Denver Broncos, and if he happens to be fully good to go for this one, I definitely like him a lot here. We know how bad this Broncos secondary is now with all their starting corners and A.J. Boye and Bryce Callahan. They're also missing a couple of other pieces as well, so as long as Keenan Allen's fully good to go in this game, I don't mind him at all. I also think Justin Herbert would be an interesting tournament play. On the season, the Broncos are 18th versus wide receivers and they're 8th versus the pass, but you gotta keep in mind the majority of those games were with their starting corners, so when you take them out of the equation, it obviously gets a lot softer going up against backup corners, the guy like Keenan Allen's talent. And we had the 2 Rams wide receivers here in Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp, and this actually has been switched. We usually see Cooper Kupp as the more expensive Rams wide receiver. Robert Woods is the cheaper option, but Woods has been outplaying Kupp recently. He's also been getting more targets, so that price has switched now on DraftKings. And I usually say I'll take the cheaper option of the 2, which would mean play Cooper Kupp over Robert Woods, but I think both are fine options here. If you had to pick one and price wasn't an issue, I would say Woods over Kupp, but both options are fine. It's a great matchup versus Seattle. I know they've been getting better defensively this season, but they still rank dead last versus wide receivers, over 47 points per game and over 200 receiving yards. Also 25th versus the pass. And I think this is a nice bounce back spot here for the Los Angeles Rams. So both these guys are certainly in play. If you want to pair them up with Robert Woods with Jared Goff, you can play both or you can just play one. I think both options are fine. Then after that, we kind of get out of the mid-range into some lower tier wide receivers. So we have Hollywood Higgins here at $4,800. bucks, and I think he's just a fine tournament pairing with Baker Mayfield. Wouldn't really go there in cash games, but in tournaments, I think it's fine because there is some upside there. He's playing pretty much the majority of the snaps. He's getting targets every single week, and him and Baker always have had a great connection. I've been saying that for a couple of years now. Also, that matchup versus the Jets, you really can't beat it. They're dead last DVA versus the pass, and they rank 27th versus wide receivers when it comes to fantasy points allowed per game. So, like Higgins in tournaments, but not really that great of a cash game play in my opinion, because if they get to a lead, they're just going to ground and pound with Chubb and Kareem Hunt. Then dropping down $100 to T. Higgins at $4,700. If Tyler Boyd happens to not be good to go for this game, we know he exited the game on Monday night. Now it's a short week on to Sunday. I think there's a good chance that he happens to miss that game, and he's actually the wide receiver averaging the most targets per game on that offense. So if you take him out of the equation, that's obviously going to be a bump for guys like T. Higgins and A.J. Green. You can throw in A.J. Green's name in the mix here as well. He's in that 3K range, but I would prefer T. Higgins. He'd be the wide receiver one on the offense. And on the season, the numbers haven't been too bad. It's just production has obviously dropped off without having Joe Burrow, but I think he'd still be a fine option versus Houston. They're 8.5-point dogs on the road here, which should lead to a pass-heavy game script. You know the Houston defense is nothing to be concerned about. They're 26th DVA versus the pass, and they're 23rd versus wide receivers. So I think T. Higgins would be an interesting option if Tyler Boyd happens to miss this game. Then Jamison Crowder at $4,500. So, and this is actually a pretty good spot for Jamison Crowder. I'm assuming the Jets are going to be trailing in this game. If you are going to stack the Browns passing attack, or you could even use Nick Chubb, you could always use Jamison Crowder as a run back, as they should be throwing the ball quite a bit as 9.5-point dogs at home here. On the season, he's got a 25% target share. We know Sam Darnold loves throwing it to his slot wide receiver. And on the season, Jamison Crowder is playing 3/4 of his snaps in the slot. So we should avoid Denzel Ward for the most part, as Kevin Johnson is the main slot corner for the Cleveland Browns. And Denzel Ward really hasn't went into the slot too much this season. And they rank 24th DVA versus the pass and 21st versus wide receivers. So I think Jamison Crowder is a fine run back tournament option, or a fine one-off in cash games as well. Then Josh Reynolds is only $3,200 in a great matchup versus Seattle. And last time they played Seattle, it was pretty cheap, and he actually paid off his price tag pretty easily at around 17 Draftkings points in that game. He was also heavily targeted as well. Now in recent weeks, the targets have been way down for Josh Reynolds, but he's still playing the majority of these snaps. So if he can get us like 5-ish targets in this game, I think he can pay off his price point of only $3,200 if you need an absolute value wide receiver. Then, with that being said, I think we move on to the tight end position. And as usual, it's either spend all the way up for Travis Kelce or find one of these 3K tight ends, because Travis Kelce is just so much better than everybody else at his position, but he's starting to get priced out. At the beginning of the year, he was around that $7,000 price range where it wasn't that hard to fit him in, but at $8,500, that is an absolute premium, so I feel like he's a tournament play only, but it's a good matchup versus Atlanta. They're 28th versus tight ends, which means they're allowing the 5th most points per game to position, and he's by far the best tight end in the NFL. So yeah, if you got the money for him, great. He's a fine option with Patrick Mahomes, but definitely don't think he's a necessity in cash games. In cash games, you're probably spending down for one of these cheap tight ends, and we have a whole slew of them here. I'm not going to go too in-depth, but they're just fine pump plays, and you just kind of hope they get into the end zone or something like that. But Austin Hooper, he always has an outside shot of getting into the end zone. And it's also a really good matchup versus the Jets. They're allowing the most DraftKings points per game to position, and they're dead last DVA versus the pass. So I think Hooper's got a decent shot of finding the end zone. They're also allowing nearly a receiving touchdown per game to the tight end spot. So I think Austin Hooper's fine. Jordan Akins at $3,300. He's pretty hit or miss, but he had a decent game last week. But even then, we're talking like 5 to 8 points from Jordan Akins. But that's not that bad, because the tight end position outside of Travis Kelce and like Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, it's just a really ugly position. Although Logan Thomas, he's been kind of balling out, but he's now around $5,000, and I just don't really want to pay $5,000 for Logan Thomas as good as he's been recently. Then we have Zach Ertz at $3,100. I know it doesn't feel great wanting to play Zach Ertz, but he's been playing. He played around 75% of the snaps last week, and he had 8 targets as well. He only caught 2 of them, but he had 69 yards, and he's really cheap versus Dallas. And I know Dallas hasn't been that bad versus tight ends this year, 10th versus the position, but they're still 23rd DVA versus the pass. And if Zach Ertz can give me a handful of targets at $3,100, I do think he is viable, although he's definitely not the most exciting play in the world. Then you have Cole Kmet at $3,000 in a great spot versus Jacksonville. They've struggled versus tight ends this season. They're ranked 21st versus the position, in addition to being 31st DVA versus the pass, and also close to a full receiving touchdown per game to tight ends. Also, he played 100% of the snaps last week. He was on the field the entire game. That's really all I can ask for a guy that's $3,000. Before that, he had back-to-back games with 7 targets. Only had 2 targets last week, but could be a decent bounce back spot here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. And like I said, he's on the field, and that's good enough for me. And as for the defenses, I mean, I hate really talking about defenses, but I mainly just try to pick favorites here. But we have the Browns defense versus the Jets. I feel like that's self-explanatory. Getting Denzel Ward back was definitely a big boost for their secondary. The Bears are playing Jacksonville. Again, I think that kind of speaks for itself. They have 1 win this season. The Texans, very bad defense, but I'm not that scared of Cincinnati, even though they did beat up on the Steelers last week, but I don't really see that happening again. And then the Panthers at $2,700. Who knows what's going on with the Washington football team quarterback situation? We saw Dwayne Haskins get caught at a strip club without a mask, so they said he might be able to miss some games and lose his game check. So we'll see who the starting quarterback is going to be for the Washington football team. I know the Panthers defense is not that great, but they're cheap and kind of a mess right there. Although if they get Antonio Gibson back, that would definitely be a boost for the football team's offense and a downgrade for the Panthers defense as they struggle versus the run all season long, but only a 23.5 implied team total against them. But with that being said, guys, that's going to be it for this video. So I hope it was helpful. If it was, make sure you leave a like. And if you're new to the channel, hit the subscribe button. It really helps me out, and I really do appreciate it. Follow me on social media if you haven't already. If you want to support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that if you want access to the entire NFL DFS data sheet. I'll continue posting these for the playoffs. I also do NBA each and every single day if you're interested in that. I'm not going to be posting videos for it just so I have more time to do NFL content for you guys on YouTube, but I think that's pretty much it. So I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your week. Christmas is coming soon. I'm sure a lot of us are excited about that. And I'll see you guys in the next video.